This case brings us to April 2013 in Davis, the largest city in Yolo County, California. Oliver Jennings Northup Jr., commonly known as Chip, was born in 1925 in Grand Island, Nebraska. He served in the United States Navy during World War II and practiced as an attorney. While he had a passion for law, he was often drawn to writing, a pursuit he cultivated alongside his legal career. Chip was known for his avid reading habit and had a knack for memorizing classic literary passages. Chip loved the arts and had been playing guitar since his 30s, performing in different bands. He was also a founding member of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Davis. Claudia Maureen Maupin, born in 1936, was described by her daughter as a spiritual traveler, moving throughout different religions and denominations. But when she discovered the Unitarian Church, she felt an instant connection. So much so that she said to her daughter, "My husband is at the Unitarian Church." And sure enough, he was. Claudia met Chip there and they soon fell in love, marrying in 1996. Claudia became a pastoral associate at the church and, just like Chip, she loved performing and was very active in her local theater. Her family said she had such a loving spirit and an ability to make everyone she encountered feel valued. Between the two of them, they had a big and loving family, and Chip's daughter Mary said their families blended together effortlessly. Claudia had 3 children, and Chip had 6, along with 2 stepchildren from a previous marriage. And they had 14 and 8 great-grandchildren between them. In 2013, the couple had been married for 17 years and were living in a condo in Cowell Boulevard. Their families said they were living an idyllic life, surrounded by so many people that loved them, living in a great community. Tragically, in April that year, Chip and Claudia's family and friends and the community would be left shattered by a truly frightening series of events. Daniel William Marsh was born on May 14, 1997. In 2008, Daniel made national headlines. He received an American Red Cross Heroes Award for saving his father Bill's life. Bill had had a heart attack and Daniel had used CPR to save him. But the same year, things would quickly start to unravel for Daniel. His parents began a tough and contentious divorce after it was discovered that his mother had had an affair with Daniel's former kindergarten teacher. Daniel was enraged with the woman his mother had had an affair with, and at 10 years old, he started having dark thoughts. He fantasized about killing his teacher by strangling her or slitting her throat. A year later, he told his therapist about the thoughts that he had been having and how he was fascinated with the idea of torture. He told the therapist he wanted to make these fantasies a reality. He was diagnosed with adjustment disorder with depressed mood, and as he entered 7th grade, he started seeing a clinical social worker. In August 2010, he was prescribed 1 to 2 capsules of Prozac daily. Daniel entered his teenage years going back and forth between his parents' houses who were now living apart. But when he turned 14, his dad threw him out for good due to his constant drinking and smoking, and he went to live with his mother permanently. In 2011, Daniel developed anorexia and was placed in an intensive outpatient program to help treat him. Following his release, he began taking Celexa, which was then switched to Lexapro, and then back to Prozac. He was also given antipsychotic medication. A doctor noted that Daniel had started having feelings of derealization with his out-of-body experiences occurring numerous times a week. The more time went on, the more Daniel's violent thoughts manifested. Whenever he looked at a person, he thought about how he would kill them. He developed a fascination with a site called bestgore.com, promoting gore porn and other videos showing gory content, and Daniel started setting fires and harming animals too. He also became interested in serial killers, showing a particular fascination with Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. According to one of his friends, Daniel strangled a cat in the street and said to his friends, "I just wanted to. I hated that cat." He then asked his friend if he could kill his dog too. Daniel confided in a school counselor about his thoughts, and as a result, the police were called to the school. Daniel was involuntarily hospitalized and his medication was switched yet again. Daniel later told his school psychologist about wanting to kill his classmates, possibly even by way of a school massacre. When the counselor asked if he would ever act on these feelings, he said, "I have full confidence that I could hurt these people." Following this, a police officer was again brought to the school. But at this time, it was determined that Daniel posed no danger to himself or others, and no further action was taken. Soon after this, Daniel had another meeting with the school counselor, this time going into even more detail, describing how he wanted to peel people's skin off them and cut off their eyelids. He said that these fantasies only scratched the surface of his thoughts, and that he had given up fighting them. However, Daniel's statements were not disclosed to the authorities because it was agreed upon that there was no victims. Daniel made no attempts to hide his disturbed feelings and impulses and began divulging his secrets more and more. Friends of Daniel later recalled that he said if he killed anyone and got caught, he would simply claim insanity. But Daniel's dark fantasies would soon manifest in a terrifying way. That morning, Chip and Claudia were unusually absent from their church. No one had heard from them, and their phone was ringing out. Later on, Chip failed to show up for a gig with his band. After nearly 5 decades as the guitarist and lead singer, Chip was never known to be a no-show. Chip's son, Robert, visited the couple's condo, but soon left assuming the pair had simply gone out of town. But as the evening came around and there was still no word from either of them, family members contacted the authorities requesting a welfare check be carried out. Claudia's daughter Laura, along with the police, went to the couple's home again. After ringing the doorbell and getting no answer, Laura went round the back. She and the officers found one of the windows open with the window screen slashed. Looking through the bedroom window, they saw bloodstains. Police used a flashlight to look into the couple's bedroom, and tragically, the bodies of 87-year-old Chip and 76-year-old Claudia could be made out. They were found with over 60 stab wounds each, and their bodies had been mutilated. Inside Claudia's abdomen was a mobile phone, and a drinking glass had been put into Chip's body too. The Yolo County District Attorney said, "It was the most horrific, depraved murder I've ever seen as the District Attorney of this county. The appalling murders of such a beloved couple stunned the Davis community and left everyone in a state of fear and shock. Numerous task force investigators from different areas, including 25 FBI agents, jumped on board the case. However, no physical evidence could be found at the scene. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, and no footprints. Nothing of value appeared to have been stolen, and police weren't even sure if they were looking for one perpetrator or more. No one that knew the couple could think of any possible motive. The crime seemed incredibly personal, and officers wondered if the killer or killers were close to Chip and Claudia, possibly even having a key to the condo and cutting the window as a distraction." Oliver, Chip's grandson, was briefly looked at when police found out he had schizophrenia. Robert, Chip's son, and Oliver's father said as a family, they faced 2 days of over 12 hours of questioning. But Robert said he knew his father would have wanted everyone to cooperate as much as possible, so they stuck it out without a lawyer present. When police searched Robert's home, they found that the carpet had been steam cleaned on the same day the couple had been killed, something which Robert agreed, although didn't look good, was nothing more than bad timing. They also found a picture drawn by Tony, Robert's son, which depicted a man holding a knife standing over 2 children in a bed. Chip and Claudia's family said that Tony and Oliver were so close to Chip. They both adored him and would never have acted in any violent way towards him or Claudia. The Northup family, Tony in particular, felt incredibly persecuted, and as if the finger was being pointed at him. Even though Tony's name was eventually cleared, he still felt that many people had their doubts about him, and this left him carrying a huge burden following such intense questioning and accusatory comments from so many people. Sadly, 3 years after the couple's deaths, Tony would take his own life. While the police were still working around the clock to solve the crime, the real killer was so proud of what they had done, it didn't take long for them to start bragging about it to people. On the same day the couple were found, Daniel Marsh told a close friend that he had been the one to commit the horrific crime. The following day, he confessed again to more people. He asked his girlfriend if she had heard about what had happened to the couple, to which she said she hadn't. Daniel then also told her that he had done it, smiling and telling her how amazing it had felt and proudly giving her all the details. Daniel could not stop telling people, and in the weeks that followed, he continued to talk about it to anyone that would listen, saying that it was the best experience he had ever had. And if his confession wasn't enough, he showed a friend several items that linked him to the crime scene, including the knife, gloves, and the ski cap, boots, and jacket he had worn that night. Daniel's friend and Daniel's girlfriend started speaking with each other about what Daniel had told them. They did not initially report his confessions to anyone else, as they were unsure if he was telling the truth. And if he was being truthful, they were afraid of what Daniel might do. Disturbingly, Daniel's mood appeared to improve after the murders of Chip and Claudia, and he was even named Student of the Month. But just a short while later, one of his friends informed the school that Daniel was carrying a knife around with him. Following this, he was suspended. Daniel's girlfriend broke up with him, and shortly after, Daniel crept into her house, leaving her fearing for her life. His ex-girlfriend confided in one of Daniel's friends about the incident, which prompted him to talk to Daniel's father, Bill. He told him about the murders and what Daniel had said, but Bill believed none of it. His friends finally contacted the police and spent several hours in the station telling them everything. The next day, on June 17th, a high school resource officer brought the now 16-year-old Daniel in for questioning. Daniel was interrogated by Detective Ariel Pineda and FBI Special Agent Chris Campion. Daniel's tune had drastically changed, and he spent 3.5 hours crying and denying any involvement. But when Detective Pineda played a recording of a phone call between two other people implicating Daniel in the crimes, Daniel's denials came to an end, and he started to confess. Daniel admitted to leaving his mother's house with the intention of killing that night. He left between 2 and 3 a.m. armed with a 6-inch knife and spent time wandering around the streets of Davis looking for open doors and windows. Daniel said he had found what he was looking for at 4006 Cowell Boulevard, a residence just 2 doors down from where his dad lived. He cut open a window screen and crawled through the window. He waited in the living room until he heard the sounds of snoring coming from the bedroom and then entered. It was at that point that Claudia woke up and saw Daniel and to scream. Daniel started stabbing her in the torso, with Claudia begging for her life. Chip woke up too, and Daniel then turned the knife on him. Daniel described continuing to stab the couple even after they had died, saying it just felt right. He told the officers what he had done in gruesome and graphic detail and told them all the evidence they needed was in his mother's garage. He had kept the bloody clothing and knife as souvenirs, and it was determined that he had put tape around his shoes to avoid leaving footprints. During his interrogation, Daniel said, "It was pure happiness and adrenaline and dopamine, just all of it rushing over me." He said these feelings were only heightened when Chip and Claudia were conscious and resisting against the attack. Daniel was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special enhancements for intentionally killing more than one person, demonstrating exceptional depravity in the killings, lying in wait to kill the victims, and inflicting torture. He also faced enhancements for the use of a deadly weapon during the murders. Daniel Marsh entered a plea of not guilty, but later changed this to not guilty by reason of insanity, something officers were already anticipating. Daniel was set to be tried as an adult, although his juvenile status made him ineligible for the death penalty and life in prison without parole. The maximum sentence he faced was 52 years to life. Daniel's attorneys, 2 of the top public defenders, argued that the maximum sentence would constitute cruel and unusual punishment when imposed on a juvenile. But prosecutors were fighting hard for the maximum possible sentence to be issued, believing nothing else would be appropriate. Assistant Chief Deputy DA Michael Cabral said that in the almost 3 decades he had been a prosecutor, he had never seen such a heinous and reprehensible act or a defendant with such an evil soul. Daniel's defense team called in a psychiatrist, Dr. Matthew Solier. When he first met Daniel, Daniel threatened to kill him. He found Daniel to be mentally ill, but sane and responsible for the crimes. Despite this, Daniel's attorneys pressed on with the insanity defense and filed a motion to suppress his June 17th confession, arguing that the interrogation began under false pretenses and that Daniel had made many requests to go home. His attorneys also argued that the various different medications Daniel had been prescribed over the years had had a huge effect on his violent thoughts and fantasies. But the prosecution maintained that when you looked at Daniel's medical records, he was having these feelings long before he was taking any medication. Daniel William Marsh's trial began on September 2, 2014. Daniel was now 17 years old, and the trial was being presided over by Judge David Reed. Daniel's attorneys claimed that the side effects of the medication he had taken, combined with his mental health issues, triggered an uncontrollable rage and violence and rendered him temporarily insane. But the prosecution said that Daniel had carefully planned the murder and the entire event had been premeditated for a long time. Daniel's old friends and his ex-girlfriend all took to the stand to tell their sides of the story, and Daniel's old therapist and psychiatrist also spoke of their time working with and treating him. On September 26, 2014, after a 5-week trial and less than 2 hours of deliberations, the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. Daniel William Marsh was found guilty on both counts of first-degree murder and all the special circumstances. The next big task of the jury was to determine whether Daniel was deemed sane or insane. For days later, they had reached that verdict too. The jury found Daniel to be sane when he had committed the murders. Judge Reed sentenced Daniel to the maximum term of life in prison with parole eligibility after 52 years. He was given 25 years to life for each count of murder plus 2 years for special enhancements. Judge Reed pointed out that Daniel was proud of his crime and mutilated the victims' bodies out of curiosity. He also stated that Daniel's actions were not recklessly impulsive. They were very much pre-planned and thought out. When Senate Bill 260 was passed regarding the sentencing of juvenile offenders, it meant that if the sentence given was less than 25 years to life, when the offender reached their 20th year of incarceration, they could be eligible for parole. If the sentence is greater than 25 years to life, eligibility for parole would occur in their 25th year of incarceration. California voters also passed Proposition 57 in 2016. This meant that judges in a juvenile court must decide whether a young offender be tried in an adult court or a juvenile one. 2 years later, the Supreme Court in California ruled that this could be applied retroactively for cases that hadn't yet reached their conclusion. In February 2018, the California Court of Appeal conditionally reversed Daniel's 2014 conviction. It would now need to be decided whether he should continue to serve his adult sentence. A transfer hearing was held and prosecutors filed a motion to transfer him to an adult court, but the legal complexities surrounding the case continued to create many difficulties. Governor Jerry Brown signed Senate Bill 1391 into law. This meant that juveniles under the age of 16 could not be tried in an adult court. Senate Bill 1391 caused vocal opposition from both prosecutors and the family and friends of Chip and Claudia. In September 2018, the California District Attorney Association held a press conference urging the governor to veto the bill. The family of Chip and Claudia presented their cases and highlighted the damage Daniel had caused. And alongside this, prosecutors also wrote an open letter to Governor Brown, which read in part, Senate Bill 1391 eliminates the authority for a court to decide whether a 14 or 15-year-old charged with certain serious offenses is unfit for the juvenile system. In reference to Daniel, it said he savagely tortured and murdered an elderly couple in their home and methodically planned his attack. It wasn't just the families of Chip and Claudia who were outraged. Citizens of Davis sent over 300 letters to the court stating their opposition to Daniel being remanded in the juvenile justice system. Upon signing the bill, Governor Brown said that there was a need for redemption and reformation where possible. There is a fundamental principle at stake here, whether we want a society which at least attempts to reform the youngest offenders before consigning them to adult prisons, where their likelihood of becoming a lifelong criminal is so much higher, he said. He did note, however, that the testimonies he had heard from Chip and Claudia's family had weighed heavily on him. As the legal battles were being fought back and forth, a video was uploaded to YouTube. It showed Daniel Marsh giving a TED Talk from prison entitled, Embracing Our Humanity. He detailed alleged abuse and difficulties he had faced in his life and said that he was now a reformed character and should be given another chance. The video caused enormous hurt and distress to Chip and Claudia's family, as well as many others affected by Marsh's actions. The video was taken down by YouTube within 2 days of its upload, but it is still available to view on the internet. The takedown of the video was a small victory, the family said, but nothing compared to the legal battle that lay ahead. Daniel's defense team filed for a motion of continuance of the hearing for after January. This meant that by then, Senate Bill 1391 would be effective. Prosecutors hit back, however, saying that the case was being heard and dealt with current law, not a law that was in the future and yet to come. Despite their best efforts, the defense's motion was denied and the hearing went ahead. During the hearing, Daniel took to the stand himself to say why he felt his case should be heard in a juvenile court as opposed to an adult one. But the prosecution came in strong, and as part of their case, they called Matthew Logan to the stand. Matthew Logan was a forensic psychologist and an expert in psychopathy. He explained on the psychopathy checklist, Daniel had scored 35.8 out of a potential 40. He said this was one of the highest scores he had ever seen. The tension was palpable. Judge McAdams was about to read his decision. He ruled in favor of the prosecution. Daniel was remanded to state prison to continue serving his adult sentence. Judge McAdams said the risk posed by potentially him was not one worth taking. There is virtually no chance that Marsh will be rehabilitated before he turns 25 years old, he said. Claudia's daughter Victoria voiced her relief saying, "It's not about getting justice for Mom and Chip. We got that in 2014. This hearing was about safety for our family and our friends and the community of Davis." Less than a month after this decision was reached, Daniel filed a writ requesting that the order of transfer be reviewed. The issue that had to be considered was had Judge McAdams abused his on December 14, 2018. Daniel's team filed a petition requesting that the order denying the writ was reviewed. The petition raised the same issues as the writ itself, and on February 13, 2019, the writ was denied by the California Supreme Court. As the Senate bill was now in full force, his attorneys filed an appeal requesting that Daniel's conviction be overturned retroactively. In September 2021, this appeal was dismissed by the 3rd District Court. Despite the numerous hearings, appeals, and changes to the law, Daniel Marsh's sentence of 52 years to life still stands. But because he was convicted as a juvenile, he is still eligible for parole after 25 years. If he is successful, he will be in his early 40s. The impact of Daniel Marsh's actions were felt by so many people. Special Agent Chris Campion had interrogated Daniel and said that the idea of him ever being released from custody filled him with dread, and that he is in the top 3 people he is most scared of. Campion believes that Daniel was without a doubt a serial killer in the making. For the family and friends of Chip and Claudia that already suffered through so much pain, the added angst and uncertainty surrounding the legal changes in Daniel's possible release weighed heavily on them. Claudia's daughter Victoria described the family as exhausted, but they let their presence be known and their voices be heard throughout the trial and at all the press conferences and hearings. They are still working hard to keep Chip and Claudia's names alive and will continue to fight to see that justice for the loving and caring couple continues to be served. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. On March 8, 1970, Betty Lee Jones, a 23-year-old mother of 2 children, had been married for just 9 days. However, the last 2 days of their brief marriage were marked by intense conflict. On that particular day, a heated argument erupted between Betty and her husband, Robert Ray Jones, outside their residence near the intersection of 12th Avenue and York Street in Denver, Colorado. The argument escalated to the point where Robert left in his car, driving away from the scene. In response, Betty attempted to flag down passing cars for assistance. At around 3:30 p.m., a blue sedan stopped and picked her up. Betty was never seen alive again. Around 8:30 the following morning, 2 employees of the Colorado Department of Transportation found Betty's body on the side of an embankment along Highway 128 near the border of Jefferson and Boulder counties. She was bound and had been strangled, sexually assaulted, and shot. Investigators initially identified 6 suspects in the case. While a witness reported that Betty had been trying to flag down passing cars, police did not rule out the possibility that Betty had called someone to come pick her up at some point during that final argument with her husband. As such, several of her former boyfriends were looked at as potential suspects. Her husband also fell under suspicion, and her family considered him to be the most likely suspect for decades. Nothing conclusively tied any of the suspects to the murder, however, and Betty's case went cold. Betty's son and daughter were adopted by her parents following her death. When her son Benji would ask his grandfather to tell him about his mother, he would smile at him and simply say, "She was wonderful." In 2006, Betty's case was reopened and assigned to Detective Steve Ainsworth of the Boulder County Sheriff's Office. He submitted evidence from the case to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in hopes of developing a DNA profile. The lab was able to identify a male DNA profile, but it was not in any criminal database. Detective Ainsworth tracked down the original 6 suspects in the case, who were by this time living throughout the country, to compare their DNA to the profile found on Betty's body. Betty's husband, Robert Ray Jones, had passed away in 2000, but his parents submitted samples of theirs for comparison. Based on their DNA, Robert was excluded as a suspect. None of the 5 other original suspects were a match either. In 2019, the DNA profile was then submitted to Bode Technologies, who prepared the sample to be utilized by the FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team. The team developed the suspect's family tree and considered and eliminated individuals within it until they had one potential lead left, an unidentified woman listed in the 1957 Denver directory. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation had been working with genetic genealogy, and they were eventually able to identify this woman. She was married and had 2 sons who would have in their 20s at the time of Betty's murder. They had also been living in Denver at that time. One of the brothers had passed away in 1977, but the other was interviewed by authorities and agreed to provide a DNA sample. During his interview, he notified investigators that he in fact had another brother named Paul. However, Paul was estranged from the family, and he had not seen or heard from Paul since February of 1970. At that time, Paul drove a blue 1960s Plymouth Fury sedan, which was consistent with the car Betty was seen getting into on March 8, 1970. The brother was unable to provide any current information about Paul or where he was living. When his DNA was analyzed, it showed that he was a very close relative of Betty's killer, so tracking down Paul became the main focus of the investigation. Detective Ainsworth did eventually locate Paul Leroy Martin. However, he found him at the Fort Logan National Cemetery, where he was buried following his death in June of 2019. His estranged brother was his only living relative. After obtaining a court order, authorities had Paul's body exhumed on April 8, 2020. And the following day, a sample taken from his remains was submitted to the Forensic Sciences Biological Unit of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for DNA testing. 2 weeks later, they reported their results. Paul Leroy Martin's DNA was a match to the DNA found on Betty Lee Jones's body. On May 26, 2020, the Boulder County District Attorney approved a probable cause statement, meaning prison for Betty's murder. Her family is still relieved to finally have answers. "Just having the closure is amazing for us," Betty's son Benji told the Boulder Daily Camera following Martin's identification. "It gives me a lot of hope. Gives my family hope that others will find closure on some of their cases. They are also grateful that law enforcement never gave up on the case. We praise God for bringing us people like Steve Ainsworth," Benji said. "He worked so hard on this. And I could tell in his voice the compassion he has and the diligence he has and the work ethic to exhaust every resource possible and everything at his disposal to finish this." May 17, 1999 started out as a typical morning for 39-year-old Saad Kawaf. Around 9:30 a.m., he got ready to leave his home in the gated community of Deerwood on the south side of Jacksonville, Florida, to go to the bank. He and his wife owned the Forest discount store at Forest and Beach Boulevards in Jacksonville, and he made large cash deposits several times a week. He said goodbye to his wife and walked out of the house. A few minutes later, however, his wife heard a scream from outside. She opened the door to her garage and saw her husband being attacked by a man. Then a woman attacked Mrs. Kawaf, dragging her back into the house and tying her up. Mrs. Kawaf fought against her attacker, baiting her as she tried to get away. The 2 attackers ran off with the money Saad had been taking to the bank, approximately $30,000 in cash. Mrs. Kawaf survived the attack, having sustained only minor injuries, but Saad had been beaten and stabbed multiple times and died from his injuries. Saad's friends, family, and employees were all devastated by his loss. customers left flowers outside of his store. A $100,000 reward was offered for information that led to the arrest of his killers. Mrs. Cowoff was able to provide descriptions of the people who killed her husband. They were both white, and the man had been between 5 feet 9 inches 6 feet tall. He had reddish blonde hair and a graying mustache. The woman had been very petite, slim, and around 5 feet 2 inches tall. Curiously, she had worn a long skirt to the robbery and murder. A composite was developed of the female attacker and shown to employees. Co-op's neighbors had been out walking her dog around the time of the murder and saw an unfamiliar red Jeep Cherokee drive away from the Coiff's home. The owner of the Jeep was never identified. Police were also unsure of how the Jeep gained access to the gated neighborhood, as it was not in the gatehouse records or accounted for by any of the residents. Fingerprints and DNA were left behind at the scene. 2 DNA profiles were isolated in 2003. The DNA from the female attacker was left behind from the bite wound Mrs. Cowoff inflicted on her. And police have confirmed that the second profile was from the male attacker but have not discussed exactly how it was left at the scene. The DNA was run through criminal databases several times in the ensuing years, but no matches were ever found. In May of 2020, therefore, the profiles were submitted to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Laboratory so that genetic genealogy could be used to uncover the identities of the 2 suspects. In June of 2020, the lab was able to do just that. The male suspect was 64-year-old William Bear, and the female suspect was 50-year-old Melissa Jo Schaefer. The 2 had been married at the time of Saad's murder but had since divorced. Bear was taken into custody in Jacksonville on the evening of July 1, 2020, and Schaefer was taken into custody in Jefferson City, Missouri the following day. They had both been charged with murder and armed robbery. Bear had been an active member of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office at the time of Saad's murder, working specifically as a detective with the Intelligence Division. He had been assigned to surveil the Cowoff home. The Sheriff's Office suspected that Saad was selling pseudoephedrine, a controlled decongestant, illegally at his store, and they knew that he kept large amounts of cash in the house. Bear joined the Sheriff's Office in 1975 and retired from it in 2002. Concerns have already been raised that his arrest could lead to new appeals from any number of people convicted based on his testimony or through his investigations over his 27 years with the department. Bear also testified to a grand jury in 2003 after his retirement as a part of a police corruption investigation. Schaefer does not appear to have been returned to Florida as of July 17th. Bear is being held without bond, and his next court appearance is scheduled for July 23rd. Following the arrests, Saad's niece, Heather Kyle, released a statement on behalf of the family. "We are thrilled. We are grateful. Not a day has gone by that we don't miss our beloved Saad. The past 21 years have been the hardest, to not only be without a man who meant so much to our family, but to know that the people who did this were not held accountable for their actions. We are grateful to the brave members of the Cold Case Unit and all members of law enforcement who have worked tirelessly on our behalf to ensure justice and that Saad's memory will never be forgotten." Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. Susan Eads was one of 5 children. She was beautiful and vivacious, and according to her brother, Dennis, she was a spitfire. In 1983, she was working as a waitress in several bars in the greater Houston area and taking DJ gigs as she could find them. On August 30th, 1983, Susan worked at the Prickly Pear, a bar inside of the Holiday Inn in Webster, Texas. After getting off work early, she went to the nearby Jason's Brown Saloon. This would be the last place she was ever seen alive. Witnesses would later report that a white male wearing a cowboy hat had asked Susan to dance at the saloon, but she declined. She was later seen leaving the establishment alone. The following day, Susan's body was found in a vacant lot near the intersections of NASA Road 1 and Elam Street in Seabrook, Texas. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death with a jumpsuit she had been wearing the night before. Her car, a 1976 Chevrolet Monte Carlo, was located in the parking lot of Gulf States Yachts, a boat store not far from the crime scene. Susan's purse, her Clear Lake High School class ring, and the gold necklace she had been seen wearing the night before were all missing. Authorities were able to develop a composite sketch of the man seen talking to Susan at Jason's, but with little physical evidence at the location where she was found, they had few other leads to follow. Shortly after Susan's death, her mother, Shirley, began receiving strange phone calls. But first, the caller would hang up when Shirley answered the phone. Eventually, he began speaking to her. By this time, Shirley had already notified the police of the calls, and they had arranged her to be able to record them. The caller identified himself as Bill and claimed to live on Telephone Road in Houston. He told Shirley he had photographs of Susan and talked about the possibility of meeting with Shirley to show them to her, but never made such arrangements. The calls did not necessarily come from Susan's killer and may have been from someone harassing Shirley after reading about Susan's murder in the local newspapers, but police still investigated them. These phone calls were a major part of a renewed effort to solve the long cold case in 2017. The tapes of the calls were restored, and a language expert from Rice University was consulted about the voice of the unknown man. Part of one of the calls was also released to the public in early 2018 in hopes that someone would recognize the voice. At this time, investigators had a piece of evidence that the technology available in 1983 had been unable to properly utilize: a male DNA profile found in a sample on the jumpsuit Susan had been strangled with. Investigators began looking at another known killer as a potential suspect in Susan's case: Anthony Allen Shore, the so-called tourniquet killer who sexually assaulted and strangled with a ligature at least 4 between 1986 and 1995. Because of the similarity between his crimes and Susan's murder, the Texas Rangers investigated without any other identified suspect to compare the crime scene DNA to, and no matches to it in criminal databases. Authorities turned to genetic genealogy research using public genealogy databases. Months of research using public genealogy databases. This relative had been just a child at the time of Susan's death and had no relationship with the killer. They cooperated fully with the investigation and helped narrow down its focus even further until they finally identified their suspect: Arthur Raymond Davis. Davis was a 35-year-old Vietnam veteran working as a fishing boat captain in 1983. He bears a striking resemblance to the composite sketch of the man who asked Susan to dance at the saloon. Investigators presented the evidence they collected to the Harris County District Attorney's Office and believed that it was strong enough to indict Davis in the case. Unfortunately, Davis cannot be charged in the case. He died in a single-vehicle accident on NASA Road 1, less than a mile away from where Susan's body was found, in January of 1984, 4 months after her murder. While Susan's family agrees with law enforcement's belief that case is solved despite the lack of any possible trial or conviction, they still hope that the public can help them. They are hoping that individuals who knew Davis will come forward and help them understand the motive in the murder. Given Davis's resemblance to the composite sketch of the man who asked Susan to dance the last night she was alive, it is easy to imagine that he followed her out of the club and attacked her because she rejected him. However, this is just a theory, and while the resemblance between Davis and the sketch is striking upon comparison, there is still no proof that it was Davis in the saloon that night. Men with mustaches wearing cowboy hats are certainly not unusual in Texas. The Eads family hopes that an old friend of Davis may be able to identify a link between him and Susan or tell them about his state of mind in August of 1983 to help them try to understand why the crime was committed now that they know who perpetrated it. On June 26, 2020, Susan's family and the investigators who worked on her case gathered at the Forest Park East Cemetery to hold a service for Susan at her gravesite now that they finally have some measure of peace with her case being solved. One by one, each person in attendance placed a rose on Susan's grave. On July 16, 1973, Conchetta Sarah, known as Penny and 21 years old at the time, decided to take a day off from her job as a dental assistant to go shopping in New Haven, Connecticut. She borrowed her father's car for the outing and parked it on the 9th level of the Temple Street garage shortly before 1 p.m. Later that day, 2 teenagers witnessed Penny fleeing from a man. They initially thought she had managed to escape from him, but then saw the man quickly return to the car moments later, holding something shiny in his hand. Tragically, Penny did not manage to escape. She had tried running up a staircase, but her attacker had reached her after she made it up just a few steps and stabbed her once in the chest. Penny's body, curled in the fetal position, was then left in the narrow concrete staircase. Penny had been, at least in part due to circumstances, very mature for her age. She lost her mother, Pauline, to cancer in 1963 at the age of 11. Penny then assumed many of her mother's responsibilities in order to keep the family home running smoothly while her father continued running the break center he owned. She cooked meals, decorated the family home, did the shopping, and cared for her beloved younger sister Rosemary. Penny's father, John Zara, would say in 1984 that Rosemary had been 100% dependent on her older sister, but his friends and family said he too relied on Penny just as much. After John was notified of his daughter's death, he was unable to eat or leave his house for several days. Perhaps because of her maturity, Penny had dated a man who was 7 years her senior. The couple was engaged to be married, but Penny had broken off their relationship because of their frequent arguments. Police looked at Penny's ex as a potential suspect early on in their investigation, but he had an alibi corroborated by numerous witnesses and his fingerprints did not match one's in evidence. Decades later, DNA evidence would also exclude him. Furthermore, the evidence at the parking garage indicated that Penny had not been killed for personal reasons. She appeared to have been killed after someone tried to steal her father's car. The car was a blue 1971 Buick Electra that by all accounts was a very nice vehicle that could have been attractive to a car thief. 2 weeks before she was killed, Penny had driven the car to Florida for a vacation. She had brought a knife with her that she had used to slice bread and cheese on the trip, and it was known to still be in the car. However, the knife was not there when police processed the car. There was also a blood trail throughout several levels of the garage and blood in the car. Police believed that someone came up to Penny to steal the car, and she stabbed him with the knife from the car in self-defense, most likely on his left wrist based on the blood trail evidence. This apparently angered her attacker as he chased after her as witnessed by the two teenagers instead of just taking the car after she fled. After stabbing her in the staircase, he did steal the car but became disoriented and could not find his way out of the double-tier parking garage. He therefore abandoned the Buick on the garage's 7th level, where it would later be found, leaving its keys and Penny's handkerchief, both covered in blood, on the ground nearby. He then left a blood trail in the 6th, 5th levels as he went to retrieve the car he had driven to the garage. Shortly after Penny was seen running for her life, a man believed to be her killer drove up to exit the garage and handed the attendant a bloody parking ticket. The attendant asked the man, who appeared to be injured, if he needed help, but he said no. The attendant then simply wiped away the blood to see how much the man needed to pay him. He did not take note of the car's license plate as it rapidly drove away after the man paid the parking fee. There had been 2 security guards assigned to the garage that day, but they had gone across the street to get a cup of coffee together at the time of Penny's murder. John Serra sued the owners of the garage for negligence and ultimately settled with them out of court for $200,000. $30,000 of that money was offered as a reward for information that led to the arrest of Penny's killer. The rest of it went towards John's personal investigation into the case. For at least the first decade after his daughter's murder, John Serra worked 8 hours a day on the case in addition to running his business full-time. He called the police multiple times a day and did provide them with some leads that kept the investigation active. He hired a lawyer and a private investigator. He spent his evenings driving the streets of New Haven and visiting the parking garage. He would look at the left wrists of every man who came into his business or he passed on the street, trying to find a scar that could have been from the wound Penny inflicted on her killer. When none of these efforts identified the murderer, he began consulting with psychics. Every year on the anniversary of Penny's murder, John would take out an ad in the New Haven Register with his daughter's picture and a reminder that her killer had still not been found. The case appeared to be solved in 1984 when an arrest was finally made in the case. Anthony Galino had attended high school with Penny and was therefore one of the thousands of people interviewed by the police in the years following her murder. By 1981, they had begun focusing in on him. Galino's ex-wife came in to speak with the police about him. Galino had physically abusive towards her and had once threatened to do to her what he had done to Penny Serra. He would deny ever making such a statement. He also had a scar on his left wrist where it was believed that Penny had stabbed her killer. He was arrested for Penny's murder on July 3, 1984. When Galino was arrested, he told police his blood was type O, which was the same type as the blood left at the crime scene by the killer. However, they never tested his blood to confirm this. The test would not be performed until May of 1987, right before the start of his trial. Galino actually had type A blood. This eliminated him as a suspect and the murder charge against him was dropped. According to Galino's attorney, the damage the arrest caused ruined his client's life. Galino died of cancer in 2008 at the age of 57. In the 1990s, authorities again thought they had found Penny's killer, an Albanian immigrant who worked in a restaurant Penny frequented and was a patient at the dental office where she worked. 2 of his dental bills had been found in the Sarah car, and the lot attendant believed the man who had given him the bloody ticket had an accent. On 2 separate occasions, a year apart, authorities had applied for warrants to arrest him, but each time the judge refused to sign them due to a lack of evidence. Despite his years of fighting for justice for his daughter, John Sarah would not live to see her killer arrested. He passed away in 1998 at the age of 74. Even as he was dying, he continued to advocate for Penny. He called Dr. Henry Lee, the forensic scientist who had been doing work on Penny's case from his hospital bed, begging him not to forget about Penny after he was gone. At the time of that final conversation, Dr. Lee did have a strong possible suspect, but he was unable to tell John Sarah about him. A bloody, unidentified fingerprint had been found on a box of tissues inside the car Penny had been driving on the day of her murder. Police had never been able to find a match to it until 1997. That year, a new search was run and finally identified it. It was the right thumbprint of a man named Edward Grant of Waterbury, Connecticut. Grant's fingerprints had not been in any criminal database until 1994, when he was arrested for domestic violence against his then-fiancée. However, authorities did not want to arrest Grant based just on one fingerprint, so further forensic tests were performed. In addition to the fingerprint, the other main piece of evidence in the case that had been preserved was Penny's handkerchief, which was found near the car. It was stained with blood from Penny and from an unknown male, presumably her killer, who was believed to have been injured by Penny. The DNA from the blood on the handkerchief was a match to Grant's DNA. In addition, chemical analysis of paint chips found inside the Buick tied them to the auto body shop Grant had owned at the time of Penny's murder. On June 24, 1999, less than 8 months after the death of John Sarah and almost 26 years after the murder of Penny Sarah, 56-year-old Edward Grant was arrested for the crime. Grant maintained his innocence and claimed that he had been in Vermont on July 16, 1973. He did also acknowledge in court documents that he was involved in a Jeep accident in 1964 while serving the Connecticut National Guard and that he sustained a serious head injury that required the placement of 4 metal plates in his skull. Following this injury, he suffered from memory lapses and mood swings. At trial, his attorneys argued that there was no identified motive for their client to kill Penny, and that the evidence had been in storage for too long before it was tested for DNA. Grant's trial lasted 20 days. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Grant guilty of Penny Sarah's murder on May 28, 2002. Rosemary Sarah was in the courtroom when the verdict was read and wept when she heard it. After this many years, my family can finally rest in peace. My father had faith in the system and now I can too, she said as she left the courthouse. Grant was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He still maintains his innocence and remains incarcerated at the McDougall-Walker Correctional Institute. 34-year-old Freddie Farah was a loving husband to his wife, Nadia, and doting father to his son and 3 daughters. He owned the Grand Park Food Store on Kings Road in Jacksonville, Florida, and was working there on May 22, 1974. Around 2 p.m. that day, a tall and thin African-American young man came into the store and asked Freddie where the frosting was. Freddie pointed him in the right direction. The young man picked up some items and then came up to the register, placing a box of cake mix, a can of frosting, and an open can of soda on the counter. He then asked what the total he owed for the items was. However, instead of paying for his items, The young man took out a gun, pointed it at Freddie's head, and demanded money. Freddie brought his hands up and the gun went off. Freddie was shot in the head and died from his injuries. His killer fled the store on foot without taking any money from the register. Freddie's children were just 11, 8, 6, and 5 at the time of his death. So many details of the murder are known because there was a witness to it in the store that day, 14-year-old Annette Bryant. Fingerprints were also found in the items the killer had left behind on the counter, but no match to them was found in 1974. Even with the fingerprints and an eyewitness, Freddie's killer was not found, and the case went cold for more than 40 years. In 1998, the fingerprints were again run through the automated fingerprint identification system, but again, no match was found. In 2016, they were run through AFIS again, but this time they found a match. 2 fingerprints found on the can of frosting, 1 fingerprint from the box of cake mix, and a palm print on the can of soda. All belonged to a 59-year-old named Johnny Miller. Miller had been just 17 years old at the time of Freddie's murder. Sometime after it occurred, he had moved to New Orleans, where he had gone on to be a popular street performer in the French Quarter known as Louis. His prints were on file as a result of a number of arrests for minor offenses. Before speaking with Miller, investigators re-interviewed Annette Bryant, who was then Annette Bryant Williams, to make sure she remembered what she had seen that day in 1974 well enough to still testify. She still remembered the crime in great detail. Detectives traveled to New Orleans to interview Miller, who denied any involvement in Freddie's murder and could not recall ever going into his store. Still, he was arrested on May 16, 2017 and sent back to Florida on July 26. He received support from New Orleans locals and tourists from around the world who had met him in the French Quarter. They raised $6,000 to help with his legal fees. On August 15th, a grand jury in Duval County indicted him on 1 count of first-degree murder. A deposition of Annette Bryant Williams was scheduled for January 18, 2018 as a part of the preparations for Miller's trial. Unfortunately, she passed away unexpectedly in December of 2017 at the age of 58. Without Annette, the case against Miller almost completely fell apart. Prosecutors could still present the fingerprint evidence, but only Annette's testimony could have tied the items left on the counter to the person who killed Freddie. They therefore offered Miller a deal that was approved by Freddie's family. If he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, he would be released, serving only the time he had been held awaiting trial. However, there was another major condition to the agreement. Miller would have to meet with the Farah family and truthfully answer all of the questions they had about the crime. Miller met with the family on April 20, 2018. He told them that he actually knew Freddie fairly well because he visited his store regularly, sometimes multiple times a day. He told them stories about how friendly Freddie had been and how he would let kids who came in to buy snacks have the items they wanted, even if they did not have quite enough money to pay for them. He claimed that on the day of the murder, he had simply found the gun somewhere and wanted to show it to Freddie. When he got to the counter, he had a sudden urge to rob the store. The gun went off accidentally when Freddie tried to swat it away. After running away in a panic, he had thrown the gun onto a train car. Miller answered all the questions the family asked him. The Farah family was convinced by some of the details Miller provided that he was telling them the truth. He also apologized to them dozens of times during the meeting, and the family ultimately decided to accept his apology. With this condition of the plea deal met, the arrangement was finalized at a court hearing on April 25th, and 61-year-old Miller was released from custody having served only 344 days for Freddie's murder. He returned to New Orleans and to performing as Uncle Louie and remains a beloved of the community there. While the short jail sentence is not what the Farah family had been hoping for, they are grateful to finally have answers to the questions that have bothered them for more than 4 decades. Am I upset that he is not spending time? I'd rather him answer my questions and give me the answers that I have been looking for all my life than to have him sitting in jail without anything, Freddie's son Bobby told the Florida Times-Union. That being said, Bobby will not tolerate Miller going back on the plea deal. Should Miller ever recant his confession, Bobby Farah has vowed to travel to New Orleans and follow Miller around the French Quarter as he tries to work with a sign reading, "This man killed my father." On May 20, 1987, two truckers were driving out of Columbia, South Carolina on Highway 378. As they passed through the town of Hopkins, they spotted what appeared to be a body in a ditch along the side of the highway, approximately a quarter of a mile down the road from the entrance to the McIntyre Joint National Guard base. They immediately notified the authorities. When police arrived, they found what would later be described as a very gruesome scene. The body was of a woman who had been shot in the face with a shotgun at close range. She appeared to have been killed at the location where she was found. Her untied shoes were found nearby. She did not have any identification with her, but she was eventually identified as 34-year-old Patricia N. Green. Patricia was a mother of 3 who lived in downtown Columbia with her children as well as her sister. Police had no leads in the case, and it almost immediately went cold. Evidence from the scene was collected and preserved. The investigator initially assigned to Patricia's case was Bill Simpson of the Richland County Sheriff's Department. At the time he was assigned the case, he had just notified the department that he would be leaving it for another position elsewhere. While he only worked on Patricia's case for a brief time, he would remain haunted by it for the next 3 decades. In 1997, the Richland County Sheriff's Department formed a cold case unit to look into old cases that had never been solved. By the beginning of 2017, they had solved 10 such cases. Jeff Fuller was a member of the unit. He had worked violent crimes with the Sheriff's Department early in his career, leaving the department in 1988 to join the State Law Enforcement Division. After his retirement from his position there, he returned to the Sheriff's Department to join the cold case unit. In February of 2017, Bill Simpson called Jeff Fuller to ask for the unit to look into Patricia's case. Despite the fact that the case was almost 30 years old, Bill was still bothered by the fact that it had never been solved and haunted by its gruesome details. Jeff Fuller agreed to take the case on, and within just a few weeks, it would become the 11th case closed by the cold case unit. DNA evidence was not used by the police at the time of Patricia's murder. In 2017, the preserved evidence from the case was re-examined in hopes that DNA could be found on it and identify a suspect. DNA was found on some of Patricia's clothing, and when it was run through a criminal database, there was a match: 53-year-old Philip Johnson. Johnson was already serving 4 life sentences at the Kirkland Correctional Institution. In 1988, he had been arrested for and later convicted of the murder of 4 in Sumter County. Patricia Green's murder had occurred right in the middle of his spree. 2 of the women had been killed before her, and the other 2 were killed after her murder. The 4 murders Johnson was in prison for had all occurred within the same area. Patricia's murder hadn't been connected with these cases because it occurred far outside that area in the next county over. Investigators from Richland County went to Kirkland to speak with Johnson, who confessed to the crime even before he was told that DNA evidence had been found and implicated him in the crime. He was able to provide details about the murder that only Patricia's killer would have known. When he was asked what the motive for the murder had been, he said that there hadn't been one. He had been on a killing spree, and to him, Patricia Green had just been another person whose life he could take. The solving of the case was announced by Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott at a press conference on March 8, 2017. Patricia's family was notified before the announcement was made, and while they are relieved to finally have closure, they opted not to speak publicly about the case. Plumstead, southeast London, a busy and bustling area offset with commons and walking paths, making up what are called the Green Chain Walks. The many routes cover several miles and boast beautiful and relaxing scenery. It was an area that many people felt safe in. However, this feeling of safety and security was shattered, as throughout 1980s-90s, a monster was stalking the streets of Plumstead. A series of horrifying and violent rapes and sex attacks were committed on the Green Chain Walks. The police investigation was a complex one. They appeared to be dealing with 2 different types of attacks. The first would take place in open areas like Plumstead Common and Winds Common. These appeared to be at random and unplanned attacks. The second type appeared to be premeditated. After watching and stalking his victim, he would attack them in their home. The one sinister trait that ran through the attacks was that he would target young mothers accompanied by their children. On one of these occasions, He raped a mother in the upstairs bedroom while her children were downstairs having breakfast. As he left, he said to her, "You should keep your door locked." As the investigation into the savage attacks continued, the country would be rocked by a sadistic and horrifying murder. Wimbledon, London. Famed for its tennis championships, people come from all over the world to experience the prestigious Grand Slam, as well as enjoy the picturesque Common. July 15, 1992. Rachel Nicole took her 2-year-old son, Alex, and the family dog for a walk on Wimbledon Common. Born in 1968, she had become a mother in her early 20s. Rachel and her partner, Andre, lived with their son, Alex, near the Common. She adored being a mother and doted on her son. Another dog walker was heading to a more secluded area of the Common when he heard a young child saying, "Wake up, Mommy." Following the sound of the voice, he soon came across a disturbing scene. Rachel Nicole had been brutally stabbed, slashed, and sexually assaulted. Alex was found clinging to her lifeless body, begging her to wake up. It was revealed she had been stabbed 49 times in a frenzied and ferocious attack. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Alex was not physically harmed. This was an area popular families, and even the more secluded parts of the Common were still fairly open. The fact her clothes were disheveled indicated a sexual motive for the murder. The Metropolitan Police came under immense pressure to catch the killer before they struck again. The ferocity of the murder left people terrified that it wouldn't be long until there was another one. 32 men were questioned over the murder, but the police's sights soon fell on one man. Carlin Stagg was known for walking his dog on Wimbledon Common. He was from nearby Roehampton and was somewhat of a social outcast. He also allegedly fit the description given by a few witnesses of a man seen in the area around the time of the murder. Because of the lack of forensic evidence to tie him to the murder or crime scene, police decided to take a different route. They asked criminal psychologist Paul Britton to create a profile of the kind of person they were looking for. They quickly decided that Stagg matched the profile and thus launched Operation Estelle. Operation Estelle was a covert operation designed in part by Paul Britton to see if Colin Stagg would implicate himself in the murder or give anything away. As the investigation into Colin Stagg continued, so too did the Green Chain rapes. The police hadn't connected the rapes to the murder of Rachel Nicole. The sex attacks that followed appeared to be emulating the Wimbledon Common murder. The violence in the rapes began to escalate. More victims began to report that the attacker was armed with a knife. One of the biggest issues the police force had was that the descriptions of the rapists were varied and vague. The man was described as around 5'7" or 5'8". The police continued to make appeals and issued an e-fit of the suspect. Several people came forward and said the e-fit looked like a Plumstead resident, Robert Napper. When officers went to speak with him, they quickly realized he was far taller than the description given of the rapist. Napper stood at around 6'2". Due to this discrepancy in height, officers ruled him out. Robert Napper's name, however, just kept coming up. It was reported that a peeping Tom was spying in the windows of houses, especially one inhabited by a lone female. He was subsequently arrested. Following his arrest, the police searched his flat on Plumstead High Street. The flat was a singular room and was tidy and organized. They also found a red metal toolbox containing hunting knives. They found an A to Z maps book with routes planned out and locations highlighted. Covered part of the Green Chain walk. The contents of the toolbox were not linked to the Green Chain rapes. As part of Operation Estelle, the police sent in an undercover officer from the Metropolitan Police Special Operations Group, SO10. She contacted Stagg and posed as the friend of a woman he had contacted through a Lonely Hearts column. Over the following 5 months, she pretended to be romantically in Stagg, spoke to him on the phone, and exchanged letters detailing sexual fantasies. She also met with him, and on one of these occasions during a meeting in Hyde Park, they spoke about Rachel's murder. To try and get Stagg to implicate himself, the undercover officer claimed to enjoy hurting people. His mumbled reply was, "Please explain as I live a quiet life. If I have disappointed you, please don't dump me. Nothing like this has happened to me before." When she went on to say, "If only you had done the Wimbledon Common murder. If only you had killed her. It would be all right. He replied, I'm terribly sorry, but I haven't. After winning his trust, the officer worked on getting Stagg to talk about his sexual fantasies. She then passed these on to Paul Britton, and he interpreted said fantasies as violent. Colin Stagg did not, however, admit to the murder of Rachel Nichol. Following the undercover investigation, Colin Stagg was subsequently arrested for the murder of Rachel Nichol, but he maintained his innocence. The psychologist who helped design Operation Estelle said he vehemently disagreed with the use of the letters detailing sexual fantasies and that he didn't know about their existence until after they had been sent. The case went to trial at the Old Bailey, and the problems in the investigation were laid bare. Mr. Justice Ognier said that the excessive zeal shown by investigators was deceptive conduct of the grossest kind. He excluded the entrapment evidence, forcing the prosecution to withdraw its case. The case was thrown out, and in September 1994, Colin Stagg was sensationally acquitted of murdering Rachel Nichol. One of the residents of Plumstead was 27-year-old Samantha Bissett. She lived in the basement flat on the edge of Winds Common with her partner Conrad and their 4-year-old daughter Jasmine. Samantha was a keen camera woman and often filmed her young daughter, documenting her life as she grew up. Conrad described Samantha as a feisty woman and a feminist, determined to give her daughter the best start in life she possibly could. Jasmine was a bright, chatty, and happy little girl. She got on well with children and adults alike and shared a deep and close bond with her parents. Samantha would often take Jasmine outside to play on the surrounding grass and in the wooded areas, making sure she had plenty of time outdoors. November 3, 1993, Conrad arrived home and found the flat door locked. Believing Samantha must have taken Jasmine out, he let himself in. He noticed an odd stain on the carpet as he opened the front door. Upon going into the kitchen, he saw Samantha's clothes strewn all over the floor. It was then he realized that something was seriously wrong. After he entered the living room, the horrifying picture of what had occurred came to light. Someone had forced their way into Samantha's flat and stabbed her more than 70 times in the chest and neck. She had also been mutilated post-mortem. Then came the next question: where was Jasmine? Jasmine was found in her bedroom, where she had been assaulted and then smothered to death. Detective Sergeant Alan Jackman was one of the first officers to arrive at the Bissett residence. He explained that this did not appear to be a first offense. This was a criminal whose violence had escalated and progressed to this point. The crime scene was so horrific, the police photographer needed to take 2 years off work as it had completely traumatized him. She had been stabbed with such ferocity it is believed she had died quickly. The killer then dragged her body into the living room before mutilating her. Forensic examinations initially turned up nothing. Due to the lack of fingerprints, it was believed that the murderer had worn gloves. But further analysis revealed that the fingerprints of the killer were almost identical to Samantha's, meaning they weren't initially distinguished from each other. When they were checked against police records, it came back with a match: Robert Napper. In May 1994, officers went to his flat and took him into custody. Samantha's partner Conrad described that she had woken up one night and had seen a face in the window staring at her as she slept. It is believed that this was Robert Napper and that he had been stalking her before killing her. Around the time of the murder, a witness reported hearing the voices of 2 male assailants, with one shouting at the other to leave it. It is believed that this was Napper arguing with and shouting at himself. When it was announced that Napper had been arrested, those who were his acquaintances and those who worked with him were shocked by the nature of the horrific killing. The usually quiet and withdrawn Napper did not, on the face of it, seem like the kind of person capable of committing such an offense. But who exactly was Robert Napper? He was born on February 25, 1966 to Brian and Pauline. Shortly after his birth, his parents moved from Erith, London to the nearby area of Plumstead, and he was the oldest of 4 siblings. Napper's childhood was highly dysfunctional and marred by domestic violence. He often saw his father attacking his mother, and fights between the pair were frequent. When Robert turned 9, his parents divorced. Concerned for their welfare, social services had him and his siblings removed from the home and taken into care. They also had to undergo psychiatric evaluations to assess the damage their tumultuous childhood had caused and subsequently required treatment. Robert would have psychiatric treatment at Maudsley Hospital for 6 years. Robert's school life was also deeply unhappy. He attended Abbey Wood Comprehensive, where he had frequent problems. As a result of having undiagnosed autism spectrum disorder, previously referred to as Asperger's, he was socially awkward and struggled to make and maintain friendships in his class. He was often the target of bullies and was picked on by both boys and girls. His peers would later refer to Robert as being despised throughout the school. At the age of 13, his life was turned upside down. While away on a camping trip, he was sexually assaulted by a family friend. The perpetrator would be sent to prison, but the damage had been done. Napper became introverted and would obsess over being clean, organized, and tidy. He became even more reclusive and distant, and his personality began to take a more sinister turn. He started spying on his younger sister while she was naked and began to bully his other siblings too. When he was a teenager, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He would often be unable to distinguish reality from imagination. He would tell stories of being pursued by the IRA, captured and tortured by them with his fingers being cut off, and him being able to grow them back. It wouldn't be long until Robert Napper was on the police's radar. In 1986, Napper was convicted of an offense with an air gun. Despite his convictions at the age of 27, he got a job at a plastics factory working as a machine operator. He also moved into a flat in Plumstead and became increasingly isolated. His relationship with his mother had also begun to break down, partly due to his hatred of her new partner. While in custody for the murder of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett, officers researched his home. Further examination of the red toolbox found in his flat drew the police's attention back to the maps they had found. Napper had made a number of notes which corresponded with several of the green chain rapes. The police soon realized that the man they had in custody for the brutal double murder was most likely responsible for the more than 70 rapes and sex attacks that had been committed on the green chain walks. They also realized that the height discrepancy was due to the fact that Napper walked with a stoop, this appearing to be shorter than he actually was. His first rape is believed to have taken place in 1989 in a house that was on the edge of the common. It turned out that he had confessed as such to his mother, saying that he had raped a woman on Plumstead Common and that people were out to get him. She went to the police and told them what he had said to her. No case on file matched what his mother had told them, and no further action was taken. After this, Pauline Napper severed all ties with her son. It turned out that the sex attack had actually occurred on Winds Common, meaning the police records didn't match his mother's report. In October 1995, Robin Napper went on trial at the Old Bailey Courthouse in London for the brutal double murder of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett. Despite the initial concerns that they may not have had enough to convict him, a jury was not required in this case. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, citing psychiatric problems. He was sentenced to be held at the high-security Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Although this case had been solved, there was another that lingered over the heads of everyone: Rachel Nichol. With a botched police investigation and a wrongful arrest, the police needed to find the culprit. But the case had all but stalled. In December 19, 1995, police went to Broadmoor to interview Robert in connection with Rachel's murder. He refused to answer their questions, leaving them back at square one. In the years that passed, and with the police no closer to catching Rachel's killer, on the anniversary of the murder, the public pressure to find the culprit came back into the spotlight. 10 years after Rachel's death, DNA techniques had become more refined and readily available to the police. In 2002, Scotland Yard set up a cold case review team to look into Rachel Nichols' murder and try and unearth any new clues. The team was comprised of both current and retired investigators who pored over witness statements, looked at the files of potential suspects, and also considered the possibility that it may be linked to other crimes. When looking at the injuries that Rachel had sustained during the forensic attack and compared it with other attacks, they consulted those on the forensics team about the improvements that had been made in the science of DNA. They were able to lift the blood from Rachel's clothing and, underneath, lay the breakthrough they were looking for. In July 2003, It was reported that after 18 months of testing on the clothes worn by Rachel, a sample was enough to rule people out, but not enough to confirm the identity of the killer. A sample had been taken from the hair of Rachel's son, Alex, and upon reanalysis, it was found to contain samples of paint that they were able to trace to a metal toolbox. In July 2006, a team from Scotland Yard headed to Broadmoor Hospital. They wanted to talk to the now 40-year-old Robert Napper. Officers were there for 2 days while they interviewed him about a potential connection to the murder of Rachel Nichol. Finally, after more than a decade of waiting, the police got the news they had been hoping for. The microscopic DNA found on Rachel Nichol's clothing came back as a match to Robert Napper. The paint from the toolbox found in Alex's hair also matched the red toolbox used by Napper to hide his knives and maps. When looking at the map found in Napper's toolbox, police found something of interest. The map showed he had ventured out of his comfort zone. The distance between Wimbledon Common and Plumstead had led to him being ruled out initially, despite the similarities in the cases. On one of the pages, Isabella Plantation in Richmond Park had been heavily marked. This was within a walking distance of where Rachel had been murdered. On the November 28, 2007, Robert Clive Napper was charged with the murder of Rachel Nichol. On the December 4th that year, he appeared at the City of Westminster's Magistrates' Court. He was subsequently granted bail on the condition he be returned to Broadmoor. It would soon be time for him to enter his plea, and on the January 24, 2008, he pleaded not guilty. His trial started in November that year, and the following month he changed his plea. He entered a plea of guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nichol on the grounds of diminished responsibility. When sentencing Napper, Mr. Justice Griffith Williams said that it was vital he be detained indefinitely for the protection of the public, saying he was a very dangerous man. It is highly unlikely that Robert Napper will ever be released. When Napper was sentenced, Colin Stagg received a public apology from the Metropolitan Police for his wrongful arrest. Keith Prieta, the detective who headed the investigation into Colin Stagg, received intense public scrutiny. Despite the judge condemning their actions and Colin Stagg being acquitted, in the years that followed and before Napper was caught, Preter continued to press the idea that Stagg was guilty of Rachel Nichol's murder. In 2001, he told the ITV program Real Crime, "Colin Stagg has been through a version of justice, albeit truncated, and he has been found not guilty. But I wonder whether he can actually say, hand on heart, that he believes people will meet him in the streets and believe that." After Stagg was acquitted, Prada retired from the police force. He would later go on to face charges of corruption. The determination of the police to prove Colin Stagg was responsible was revealed to have used £3 million from the public purse, as estimated by an internal review. The same review also found that vital scientific information had been missed during the investigation. Following the 14 months he spent in custody, Colin Stagg sued the police force for damages totaling £1 million. He has co-authored 2 books about his case, Who Really Killed Rachel, with novelist David Kessler, and Pariah with journalist Ted Hans. Pariah was published the same day Napper appeared in court to enter his plea for Rachel's murder. In 2010, the Independent Police Complaints Commission released a report following an investigation into the conduct and actions of the Metropolitan Police Force. It detailed what it described as a catalog of bad decisions and errors. It suggested that had the police acted accordingly on the tip-offs about Napper and his behavior, including the one by his own mother, the lives of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett could have been spared. The Independent Police Complaints Commission said that as all officers involved had retired and a key senior officer had died, nobody would face disciplinary action. It also ruled out any criminal prosecutions. The female police officer who went undercover in Operation Estill took early retirement from the police in 1998. She would later sue the Metropolitan Police Force after being given support by the Police Federation for damages. It was settled out of court and she received a £125,000. This move prompted harsh criticism, including from Rachel Nichol's son when he got older, who had received less than a fifth of that, just £22,000, from the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority. The criminal psychologist who helped form the investigation, Paul Britton, was charged with professional misconduct by the British Psychological Society. However, in 2002, Further action was dismissed due to a time delay in the proceedings being brought. After the intense media scrutiny following the murder, Rachel Nicole's partner Andre moved to France with their son. He wrote a book about Rachel's death called The Last Thursday in July, detailing what it was like to go through such a profound loss under such intense media scrutiny and public interest. On August 13, 2008, it was announced by the Home Office that Colin Stagg would receive compensation totaling £706,000. The extent of Robert Napper's crimes may never be fully known, and the damage and hurt his actions have caused are incalculable. Conrad Elam continues to keep the memory of his partner Samantha and daughter Jasmine alive, talking about them and the impact they had on so many people, ensuring they will never be forgotten. Rachel Nicole's partner Andre wrote a public letter of apology to Colin Stagg for pointing the finger at him publicly, saying in an interview with The Guardian, "As a parent, you have to set an example. I can't expect Alex to behave in a certain way if I wasn't prepared to do it myself. I made a mistake based on information from apparently reliable sources. I helped put a spotlight on him, which made his life worse." Her son Alex remains incredibly close to his father, and they now live in Barcelona. Alex went on to write a book about his experiences titled Letting Go, a true story of murder, loss, and survival. According to Andre, Rachel continues to live on through their son. Her sharpness of intelligence, her wicked sense of fun, and her movements too. Rachel was tall and elegant, a dancer. Alex has that same elegance. You see it in his gestures, his eyes, his presence. It's been a marathon, but I can look at Alex now and think, I'm in clear water. Mission accomplished. Alex got me through. And Rachel. Matthew Kraft hailed from Washington, Connecticut, a small town where he was known for his sweet and honest nature since childhood. As he grew into his teenage years, he maintained his integrity and dedication. While attending 10th grade at Kent School, he resolved to pursue a career in the Marines. Following his graduation from Kent School, Matthew enrolled at the Citadel, a military college in South Carolina. In 2016, he successfully completed his studies at the Citadel and was commissioned as an officer in the Marine Corps. In February of 2019, 24-year-old Matthew had reached the rank of first lieutenant and was serving as a platoon leader with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines at 29 Palms, part of the 1st Marine Division based at Camp Pendleton in California. At the end of that month, he had 2 weeks of pre-deployment leave before his unit was due to deploy to Afghanistan. Matthew planned to use the majority of his leave on a 10-day hike along the High Sierra route, which runs parallel to the John Muir Trail and goes through both Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. He planned to begin the 195-mile trek in the Sierra Nevada mountains in the Inyo Forest at the Kearsarge Pass and end it near Bridgeport in Mono County. He began the journey on February 24th with plans to complete it on March 4th or 5th, but brought enough supplies to allow him to survive for several more days if he were delayed. Matthew had submitted detailed plans for the hike to the Marines who approved his plans for his leave. He had also shared these plans with his family, but they were more concerned about his safety, completing the challenging hike on his own. Matthew would be hiking at elevations between 9,012,000 feet, and most of the ground would be covered in a thick layer of snow. Matthew had previously hiked the route in the summer of 2018 as preparation for this trek, and was looking forward to accomplishing this even more challenging winter hike, which would require him to ski for much of his journey. He had made meticulous plans and brought the necessary equipment for such an intense trek through the backcountry. He was a very experienced hiker who had previously gone on a 2-week trek on the Cohoes Trail through New Hampshire and Canada and had hiked 40 peaks in the White Mountains. He had plans to hike the Appalachian Trail. Matthew also had extensive training with the Marines that helped him for the difficult conditions he would be facing on his hike. He had twice gone through mountaineering training at the Marines Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport. In most of the physical tests he was subjected to in the Marines, he was almost always the person to beat. Matthew spent his weekends and shorter leave periods on hikes in the mountains. While he enjoyed the outdoors, he had a higher purpose for spending so time in difficult and remote areas. He believed that improving his survival skills and physical health made him a better Marine. This final intense hike before his deployment was his own personal final training activity before he left for Afghanistan. While Matthew had estimated that his hike would end on either 4th or 5th, depending on the numerous variables that go into such an intensive endeavor, his family became concerned by the 4th. When Matthew's father, Greg, did not hear from him that day, he alerted the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. They searched the various trailheads in the area where Matthew may have come out of the wilderness that night. They also looked at cell phone records, which showed that the last activity on Matthew's cell phone had been near Independence, California, close to where Matthew's hike was set to begin in Inyo County. Inyo County Sheriff's Office Search and Rescue began their search of that area in the first several miles of Matthew's planned route the following day. On March 8th, around 9 p.m., they located Matthew's vehicle at a campground near Lower Grays Meadows, north of Independence. As far as authorities could ascertain, Matthew had begun his hike as planned, but never completed it and was still somewhere in either Sequoia or Kings Canyon Park. 13 different agencies were a part of the extremely difficult search for Matthew. Marines from the Mountain Warfare Training Center, where Matthew previously had trained, were a part of the military effort to find him. Over the next 10 days, an area the size of the state of Rhode Island would be searched. The terrain along Matthew's planned route was challenging enough under good conditions, and winter storms raged during several days of the search for him, making the effort even more difficult. On March 9th, approximately 2 miles into the route from the Kearsarge trailhead, a search team on foot found a massive recent avalanche debris field. Evidence of several smaller avalanches was also found in the area. Due to the potential risk to the teams on foot, the search shifted to become primarily aerial. On March 15th, low flying using thermal imaging picked up a heat signature, and hopes were renewed that Matthew would be found alive. Unfortunately, the heat was found to be coming from a hibernating bear. Following this disappointment, the search was scaled back from an active search and entered a limited continuous mode. While his remains have never been found, the Marines consider Matthew to be deceased. Given the timeline of events, severe weather, and increased avalanche activity in the search area, on-scene search and rescue experts have determined that craft was most likely overcome by severe weather and exposure. Captain Paul Gainey, a spokesperson for the 1st Marine Division, said in a statement made on April 11th, "The Marine Corps will continue to stand by and support Craft's family, friends, and Marines during this difficult time." The Marines list Matthew's date death as March 15, 2019, the last day of the active search. Matthew was posthumously promoted to the rank of captain. The backcountry Matthew had been hiking is generally only without a thick layer of snow on the ground in August-September. The Craft family was hopeful that during this 2-month window, new searches under better circumstances would lead to the discovery of Matthew's remains. Park rangers led 2 search teams to look for them. Because the terrain is so challenging, only highly experienced hikers can search the area where Matthew disappeared, meaning that there cannot be as robust of a volunteer search effort using members of the general public as there is in other cases. Flyers were distributed among the hikers traveling along the Sierra High route with information about Matthew and the specific type of gear he had taken with him for his hike, like his Katadyn water filtration system, QuickPoint sleeping system, and Scarpa T1 ski boots, in hopes that should a hiker come across any of this equipment during their own hikes, they would know to report its location. Matthew's family has accepted the fact that he most likely died somewhere in the mountains. They have purchased a gravesite for him and ordered a headstone for it. They held a memorial service for him at the First Congregational Church of Washington back in Connecticut in September of 2019. However, they still hope to locate Matthew's remains and lay him to rest. They hope this will provide more details about Matthew's final days. They also hope that the location where the remains are found will help narrow down the day Matthew died, which they believe will help with their mourning process. Without that, it's going to be 3 weeks of mourning every year, Matthew's father, Greg, said in 2020. There's 365 days of mourning now. An electric candle sits in the middle upstairs dormer window of the Craft family home. Every night, Matthew's father turns it on to symbolically light his son's way back home. Each time he turns it on, he says, "God bless Matt," and repeats that phrase every morning when he turns it off. 46-year-old Bradford Broach was a native of Tulsa, Oklahoma, but lived with his wife and 3 daughters in Allen, Texas. He worked as an accounting manager at the Beck Group, an architecture and construction firm based in Dallas. In the summer of 2016, he took a trip to Alaska with one of his daughters and stayed at the Hotel Alyeska at the Alyeska Resort in Girdwood. However, his daughter returned to Texas before he did, and he remained in Alaska for a few extra days. On Tuesday, August 2nd, Bradford hiked up the North Face Trail near his hotel. He rode a tram back down after completing the hike up, disembarking it at 9:05 p.m. At 9:45, he signed the trail log at the trailhead for the Winter Creek Trail. While 9:45 p.m. sounds like a very late time to start a hike to most people, there was still plenty of daylight left for Bradford's hike. This part of Alaska has over 17 hours of daylight a day in August on average. There would have been enough light left for Bradford to hike safely for almost 2 more hours. Bradford briefly talked with another person at the trailhead before heading onto the trail for his hike. Bradford's family did not hear from him the following day. His wife reported him missing at 6:30 in the morning on Thursday, August 4th, when he failed to board his flight back home. Bradford's belongings were still in his hotel room, and his rental car was still parked in the resort spot. He never signed out at the trailhead, and there was no other evidence that he had ever come back from his hike. According to the Alaska State Police, there was still a strong signal from Bradford's cell phone at 10:32 the night he disappeared. The cell phone signal placed him in the Winter Creek Trail system where he had gone for his hike. This was the last indication of him and his location. The Winter Creek Trail is a popular and well-maintained trail. It is wide and mostly flat. It does go through a heavily wooded area, so individuals who go off the trail have gotten lost in the woods before, but according to the Alaska State Police, they are generally located fairly quickly. The trail leads up to the edge of a narrow gorge, 100 feet up from Glacier Creek. A hand tram runs across it, allowing hikers to pull themselves over the creek to the other side in a metal basket. Once they reach the other side, they can get on to the Upper Winter Creek Trail, which is a more challenging hike. Bradford did not leave any notations about his plans when he signed the trail log, so it is unknown how far he planned to go on his hike that night. Bradford falling from the tram into the creek was an obvious initial concern during a search for him. In 2016, additional safety measures had been installed on the tram, although it is unclear if they were installed before Bradford went missing. Even with these extra features, however, there has been a fatal accident on this tram. In June of 2019, a 57-year-old man from Anchorage died after falling off the tram and missing the safety netting below. Since Bradford's body was not immediately located, if he had met with the same fate, he would have had to have gone into the water. The rushing creek was difficult to search, but a local resident did raft it looking for Bradford, and an aluminum watercraft designed for challenging conditions was later deployed to search the creek. Bradford was not found. According to Tim Despain, a spokesman for the Alaska State Troopers, because Glacier Creek empties into Cook Inlet just a few miles downstream from the hand tram, Bradford's body could not have been carried outside of the area of the water that they had searched. Over 100 people were involved with the search for Bradford. The Alaska Incident Management Team coordinated the majority of the search effort, but multiple other agencies and organizations were involved in it. Helicopters performed aerial searches, and 10 teams of search dogs were brought in. Their efforts were hampered by a lack of wind. Without the breeze to bring scents to the dogs, they picked up on few scents to follow. Several items like cough drop wrappers and pieces of food were found during the search, but given the popularity of the trail, there was no way to say if any of them had been left by Bradford. The case or evidence that Bradford was attacked by a large animal. After more than a week of active and intense searches, the teams of people searching for Bradford essentially ran out of places to look for him. The search was scaled back to a limited mode. Bradford Broach remains missing. In 1994, 34-year-old Shannon Shell was living in Tucson, Arizona with her parents. She had moved in with them 5 years following her divorce. She worked at Jason's Deli on East Broadway Boulevard. Shannon enjoyed hiking in her free time. While she was an experienced hiker, she was not a particularly skilled one. She had previously gotten lost for 2 days during a hike. On October 12, 1994, she set out to complete a goal she had previously failed to accomplish. She parked her Camaro at the trailhead of the Tangwaverd Ridge Trail in Saguaro National Monument East. Hiking the trail would take her to Manning Camp and would be a 32-mile trek round trip. She had attempted this hike once before and been unable to complete it. This does not necessarily reflect poorly on Shannon or her hiking abilities. The trail is a difficult one to hike and features steep terrain that is difficult for even more accomplished hikers. Bob Love, the chief ranger at Saguaro National Park in 2010, did not believe that Shannon would have been able to complete this hike in a single day. Shannon's timing for the trip also added another level of difficulty for her. She had just recovered from the flu. Shannon locked her valuables, her wallet and some jewelry, in the trunk of the Camaro and set out for her hike. It is believed that she had taken several water bottles, some snacks, extra pieces of clothing, cigarettes, lipstick, and cough drops with her. She never returned from the hike. Over 120 people spent over 1,000 hours searching for Shannon. Helicopters, tracking dogs, and infrared sensors were all used in the effort. 6 miles up the trail, searchers found a fire ring and some footprints. A few items were found nearby that may have belonged to Shannon, but the connection was never confirmed. The search ended after 8 days, and Shannon was presumed dead, although her remains have never been found. At 18 years old, Gail Schultz possessed a compassionate spirit and a deep passion for the arts. She found joy in playing the ukulele, writing poetry, and expressing herself through visual art, from sketching portraits to painting with watercolors. After graduating from Nazareth High School in 1952, Gail chose not to pursue higher education or enter the workforce. Instead, she dedicated herself to caring for and educating her younger brother, Paul, who was 12 years old and affectionately known as Bucci. He and Gail were technically half-siblings. Gail's mother had passed away when she was very young, and her father, Paul Sr., got remarried to a woman named Claire, who later gave birth to Bucci. While Claire was Gail's stepmother, she by all accounts loved Gail as though she were her own, and Gail could not have loved Bucci anymore, regardless of the fact that they did not share a biological mother. Bucci was unable to attend school. More recent news articles have suggested that he had some form of autism, but the exact nature of his special needs is unknown, largely because of a lack of understanding of and ability to diagnose specific conditions in individuals with developmental delays at the time. In the 1950s, special education was largely unavailable, and since Bucci could not attend standard classes, he could not go to school. Gail was convinced that he could still learn, and in addition to taking care of Bucci, she did her best to educate him as well. One of Gail and Paul's favorite things to do was walk along Black Rock Creek, which ran behind their house on Mitchell Avenue in Nazareth, Pennsylvania. The family had only lived in the home for about a year and had moved into it because their previous home, more centrally located in Nazareth, did not have very much outdoor space for Bucci to play. Gail and Bucci liked to collect rocks, and Gail would challenge Bucci to try to find the shiniest rock along the creek. On Saturday, March 7, 1953, they left home around 2 in the afternoon to go out to the creek. They first stopped at a friend's house to ask if he wanted to join them, but he could not because his father had asked him to clean their basement. Gail and Bucci then went on to the creek without him. Multiple people would later report seeing the two of them at the creek, but no one would see what happened to them next. Claire Schultz became concerned that her children had not yet come back inside within a few hours. But she would normally have already been back inside to warm up and get ready for dinner. Paul Schultz Sr.'s main career was working as a draftsman at Binney & Clark, a crayon manufacturer in the nearby city of Easton. However, he also repaired televisions and radios as a side business out of a workshop he maintained in the basement of his family's home. That day, he and an assistant, Robert Howells, were working on a television in the workshop. Around 5:20 p.m., Claire called down to him and asked him to go outside to call Gail and Bucci home. Paul then went outside, but received no answer when he called out to his children. He then walked closer to the creek, which was only a few 100 feet away from the house, to look for them. Robert Howells began packing up his tools when Paul went out to look for Gail and Bucci and was taking them out to his car when he heard Paul scream. When he looked to the creek, he saw Paul pulling Bucci from the water. Claire was in the kitchen at the time, looking out the window, and watched as her husband pulled her son out of the creek. Paul had discovered both of his children face down in the 10 inches of water in the creek. Gail and Bucci's autopsies would later estimate their time of death as 2:30 p.m., not long after they left home. But Paul would later say that his mind could not comprehend the possibility that his children were dead when he first found them. He immediately began trying to resuscitate them. Robert Howells had run into the house and called both the family doctor and the local ambulance for help. The crew of the ambulance also tried to revive the siblings and transported them to the Nazareth Fire Company for further medical assistance. Even after Gail and Bucci were finally declared dead, no one yet realized the manner of their deaths. It was initially assumed that Gail and Bucci had both died as the result of an accident, slipping, hitting their heads, and falling into the creek where they drowned. This was not an outrageous assumption. The rocks near the creek would be slippery under normal conditions, and the temperature had been just below freezing for much of the day, making ice a potential risk as well. Gail and Bucci were therefore taken from the fire company to a funeral home in Easton, rather than to the coroner. However, when the funeral director began preparing their bodies, he realized that the head wounds Gail and Bucci had sustained were too extensive to have been caused by a simple fall. He recognized that the bodies' autopsies and the police were finally notified of the siblings' deaths. At the autopsies the following day, it was determined that Bucci had been struck in the head 3 times and Gail had been struck 7 times. She also had a compound fracture on her thumb, which was believed to have been a defensive injury. The blows appeared to have come from a hammer. Both siblings had water in their lungs, indicating that they had still been alive and breathing after they were put into the creek. The police investigation into the murders faced challenges. Authorities were not notified about the crime until 9:40 p.m., more than 7 hours after the murders occurred and 4 hours after the bodies were discovered. They could not properly search the crime scene because it was dark by the time they were called in, and several inches of snow fell in the early hours of the following morning. Gail's glasses were eventually found 40 feet away from where her body had been discovered in the creek, but not until 9 days after she died, after the snow began to melt. A chisel with a plastic candle was also eventually found at the scene, but forensic tests showed it would not have caused injuries consistent with those found on the siblings' heads. The crime scene was also highly contaminated. The ambulance and the doctor's vehicle had been driven back to the creek, and dozens of neighbors had come out to the scene after Gail and Bucci were found. Gail and Bucci's distraught parents had to be investigated as a matter of protocol. They were interviewed at least 3 times in the days following the murders and were given lie detector tests. Claire and Paul were cleared of involvement. There do not appear to have been any policies on the siblings, but Gail was the beneficiary of a $17,000 trust established by her maternal grandmother, Minnie Romilly, which was to eventually be paid out to her in 3 separate payments. However, the trust specified that should Gail die, the payments would instead go to Zion Lutheran Church in Easton, meaning that there would be no financial motive to kill her at the time of her murder. Police theorized early on in the investigation that Gail and Bucci had been killed by what they described as a sex maniac, although there was no evidence suggesting a sexual motive. Gail and Bucci's cousin, Barry Ale, has theorized that his cousins may have been killed by someone who was upset by Bucci's behavior. Bucci did not speak in the way most people do, could have been angered by the exaggerated noises he tended to make. Barry Ale had been just 9 years old at the time of his cousin's murders and had frequently gone down to the creek with the 2 of them. They had seen a homeless man near the creek the week before Bucci and Gail were killed, and Barry has speculated that this man may have been involved in the murders, but this remains just a theory. There was a lot of public in the case, which helped keep the investigation active. Tips were called in about suspicious individuals and unfamiliar cars in the area at the time of the murders, but none of the tips panned out. Various groups and businesses donated money to create a large reward for information, and the local newspaper hired a private investigator and a criminologist to help with the investigation. Despite all the efforts from the police, the family, and the community, Gail and Bucci's case went cold. Paul Skelt Sr. died of a heart attack a year and a half after his children were killed in September of 1954. Claire Schultz then moved to Buffalo, New York to live near her son from a previous marriage, but was buried near Paul, Bucci, and Gail in Pennsylvania after her death in 1970. While little progress was made in the case in the ensuing decades, Gail and Bucci's memory has lived on in Nazareth. In 2011, classmates of Gail's and other alumni of Nazareth High School raised more than $2,000 to purchase a monument for Gail and Bucci. It was placed near the stadium on the campus of the larger Nazareth area high school, which was built the year after their deaths. In 2013, several of Gail's classmates worked with her cousin, Barry Isle, to compile a scrapbook of memorabilia about Gail. The 50-page scrapbook contains newspaper about her death, but also many of her art pieces and articles she had written for her high school literary magazine. It is being housed in the library of Nazareth Area High School, and plans are made to digitize the materials so that a DVD could be produced and sent to every school in the district as well as the local public library. The Pennsylvania State Police maintains a file with over 400 pages of information about Gail and Bucci's case and periodically hears from the public about it, but they have not made much progress in solving it in several decades. Timothy Eliath was a decorated Vietnam War veteran who served in the United States Marines from 1967 to 1973. His time spent serving along the DMZ left him with post-traumatic stress disorder, which eventually led to him becoming a completely disabled veteran. In February of 2009, 59-year-old Timothy was living with his sister, 62-year-old Donna Plew, in her home on East Indiana Street in Vancouver, Washington. 2009, Michelle Kraft and her husband, Keith 2009, Michelle Kraft and her husband, Keith James, arrived at their adult daughter's home street to pick her up for dinner at 7:15 p.m. As she was walking out to the car, their daughter heard 3 loud noises she feared were gunshots. As the family drove away, they happened to glance over towards Donna's house as they passed it. They saw a pickup truck that had been backed into the driveway. Its driver's side door was open and a man was lying on the ground with his leg up against it. A woman lay on the ground in front of the truck. The 2 people on the ground were Timothy and Donna. They had each been shot in the head and did not survive their injuries. Each of the siblings left behind children and grandchildren. Donna's quiet neighborhood was not usually the scene of any kind of violence, and her neighbors were shocked by the crime. Police quickly came to the conclusion that the murders had not been random and that Donna and Timothy must have known their killer. Unfortunately, no one witnessed the killer leave the scene, leaving police without a major lead to follow. Wally Stephan worked in law enforcement for 36 years, becoming a detective with the Vancouver Police Department. After his retirement, he continued working on Donna and Timothy's case as volunteer investigator with the Clark County Sheriff's Office. He said in 2016 that he has identified a person of interest he believes is responsible for the murders. Despite the passage of time, he still believes this person can be brought to justice. This is a case that is solvable, he told ABC 6 News. Something can be done, and we're just trying to get this case into the court system. Despite having 9 massive binders of evidence and a potential suspect, there is still not enough evidence to bring charges up against anyone and finally get justice to move it forward. Step up, make a statement, to move it forward. Step up, make a statement, tell the truth, and help the prosecutor do his job, he asked of them. 14-year-old Carla Atkins and 16-year-old Vicky Stout lived in a mobile home just outside the small town of Dover, Tennessee with their mother, 4 brothers, and 2 other sisters. The sisters were half-siblings who had the same mother. Vicky's father, Leland Stout, had been murdered just a year after she was born. His roommate had stabbed Leland to death because he had been singing and keeping him awake. On the afternoon of September 17, 1980, the sisters rode the bus home from school and decided to walk down State Route 79 to an establishment called The Furnace, which was less than a mile away from their home. The Furnace was a restaurant, a bait shop, and a convenience store, and Carla and Vicky went there to buy snacks. After they left the store, witnesses saw them as they were talking to a man in a blue truck. They were never seen alive again after that sighting, and their mother, Margie, reported them missing to the police after they failed to return home. It was out of character for Carla and Vicky to go off on their own, but they were still initially categorized as runaways by the authorities after they were reported missing. Their family continued searching for them for the next 2.5 weeks. On October 5th, Two hikers were walking along an old logging trail in what is now known as the Between the Lakes National Recreation Area. They discovered Vicky and Carla's bodies buried in shallow graves, 75 feet apart from each other. Autopsies would reveal that each of them had been shot in the head with a shotgun. It appeared the girls had been killed where they were found. K-9 units were brought in to search the area where the remains were found. Investigators tried to connect the case to others in nearby areas, and more than 30 potential suspects were identified. Attorney Ray Crouch reopened the case, conducting new interviews and asking the FBI for assistance, because Carla and Vicky's bodies had been found on federal land. The sketches of the man witnesses saw in the bloop truck, talking to Carla and Vicky, were also released to the public, along with a new sketch developed by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, which shows what the man the witnesses saw may look like having aged 35 years. In 2016, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam announced a reward of $5,000 for information that led to the arrest and conviction of the sisters' killer. Carla and Vicky are buried next to each other in the Standing Stone Cemetery. Despite the ongoing efforts of numerous agencies, decades after Carla and Vicky's deaths, the case remains unsolved. Their sister, Patricia Gordon, however, has not lost faith that whoever took her sisters from her will one day be held accountable. They will get their justice someday. They'll get what's coming to them, whether it be in my lifetime or not, she said in 2018. On April 12, 2014, at approximately 10 a.m., police in Pleasant Grove, Utah received a troubling phone call from a man residing in a recently constructed 3-bedroom home situated on a tranquil street. Pleasant Grove, located about 35 miles south of Salt Lake City, has a population of around 38,000 residents. The front yard of the house was adorned with scattered items, and a solitary ornament adorned the front door, adding to the peaceful and unassuming atmosphere of the neighborhood. Darren West had just been released from prison on a drugs-related charge and had gone back to his former house to sort the garage out and gather his belongings. He used to share the home with his now ex-wife, 39-year-old Megan Huntsman, and their 3 children, 11-year-old Sawyer, 17-year-old JC, and Dareen, who had just turned 18. In 2005, Darian had pleaded guilty in federal court to 2 counts of possessing chemicals intended to be used in manufacturing methamphetamine. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison, but he maintained his innocence the entire time. The house in question was owned by his parents. Megan had also ended up leaving the home in 2011 at Darren's parents' request when they found out that she had been having an affair. Hers and Darren's daughters continued to live in the house with another relative taking care of them. Megan moved around for a while, spending time living with her mother in West Valley City before moving in with her boyfriend Jimmy at Meadowood Village Mobile Home Park. Megan's mother described her daughter as very quiet, someone that kept to herself. She said she always struggled with mental health issues but never wanted to ask for help and rarely shared anything about her life, keeping secrets about a lot of things. Megan and Darren had met in high school, and Megan would soon fall pregnant with their down the line. Things started to spiral for Megan and Darren. They became addicted to methamphetamine, and this completely consumed Megan's life for years. People that knew Megan said that the mother of 2 was suffering badly from depression, was losing jobs because of her addiction, and the marriage between her and Darren was becoming violent because of the drugs. When she finally stopped using meth, she turned to alcohol, becoming heavily dependent on that instead. Her drinking became even worse when in 2012, her father took his own life. As 2014 rolled around, Darren and Megan had long been split up and were now virtually estranged. Darren was back at the house with a few other people to help him saw through his things. Whilst moving stuff out of the garage, he noticed a strong odor, something that smelled like chemicals, emitting from one of the cardboard boxes. The box read, "Baby stuff, Megan's." It was tightly sealed with electrical tape. Once pulled off, he made a gruesome and horrifying discovery. He found the corpse of a baby wrapped up inside a plastic bag. The only person he could think of was Megan. He phoned her immediately and she made a shocking admission. She said that the baby was hers and Darren's and that she had given birth when he was in prison. The baby had been stillborn, and out of fear and panic, she had wrapped it up and hidden it, scared about calling someone or going to a hospital. Darren was shaken and immediately phoned authorities. They received an order to conduct a thorough investigation of the house. Pleasant Grove police quickly arrived at the property and the home was swiftly taped off. As police were searching the garage, they found some bloody leather gloves too. Already a very disturbing scene, officers arrived at the mobile home park. Megan's boyfriend had just returned to find police cars surrounding his home, and officers said that they needed to take Megan in for questioning. One of her neighbors, a man named Mr. Brady, recalled that upon hearing the police had found the baby's body, Megan had gone to him and begged him for a gun. Whilst at the station, Megan told police the same story that she had told Darren. The baby in the box was her child. And when she realized they had been a stillborn, she panicked and didn't know what else to do. But as the search of the property carried on, to the officers' horror and shock, they came face to face with so much more than anyone could have imagined. 6 more babies' bodies were found wrapped up in either towels, shirts, or plastic bags, and then placed inside various boxes. Captain Michael Roberts described the scene as emotionally draining and hugely upsetting to the investigators. One detective said, "Some of the things officers saw in that garage they can never unsee." The tiny bodies were sent to the medical examiner's office for testing, one of which was to determine the cause of death and also determine a DNA match. Just days after the heartbreaking scene was discovered, an arrest was made that would leave the neighborhood in disbelief. Megan Huntsman was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder and was now on suicide watch in Utah County Jail. A devastating secret that had been kept under wraps for what would turn out to be 18 years was finally out in the open. All of the children found in the garage were confirmed to be Megan's. One of the babies had been a stillborn, but the other 6 had either been suffocated or strangled. There were 5 girls and 2 boys. They determined that her poor babies could have only been alive for a matter of minutes before they were killed. We are still investigating the motives to find out why this happened, how this could have happened, said Police Chief Mike Smith. In my opinion, no matter what we come up with or say, it's just not something that you can wrap your mind around of how a mother could do something like this. When officers told Megan that they had found more than one baby, she appeared confused. She later said she had just made a guess and wasn't actually sure how many they would find. The question everyone needed answers to was why. Megan eventually told detectives she wanted to help her babies avoid the terrible life she would ultimately have given them. She said her life was too chaotic, consumed by drugs and alcohol, and coupled with her mental health issues. She said she knew she couldn't take care of them physically, emotionally, or financially. "I deprive my little babies of the opportunity of life," she said. "I think my mind was just so out of it. All I was focused on was the next fix." Between the years of 1996 and 2006, Megan had fallen pregnant 7 times, and police think she would have given birth alone and in secret in her home, and there were no records of her ever having been to a hospital. Apart from the baby that had been, she had often covered them in chemicals to conceal any smell of decomposition, wrapped them up in various things, and hidden them in the garage before carrying on with her life. Begun and Darren had 3 children still living in the house, and detectives needed to know why she had made the decision to kill her other babies. She told police it all began happening after she became addicted to methamphetamine. Her first 2 daughters were born before she began using the drug. And although she was pregnant with her 3rd living daughter when she was heavily into her addiction, too many people were aware of the pregnancy, including Darren, so she had to go through with everything. After her daughter was born, she barely told anyone about her other pregnancies, and those she did tell were later told by Megan that she had miscarried. She said she was selfish and ultimately spent over a decade choosing drugs over anything else. It appeared from everything that Megan had said, it was entirely of her own doing, and no other person played a part in it. She told police she had wanted to move the bodies out of the garage, but was unsure how to do so without being caught. The majority of people said that although they noticed her gaining and losing weight over the years, they had no idea she was pregnant. Darren's family issued a statement saying they were in a state of shock and confusion. "We are mourning this tragic loss of life, and we are trying to stay strong and help each other through this awful event." Despite Darren disputing the possibility of paternity due to the affair his ex-wife had been having, he was later confirmed to be the father of all 7 babies. Darren told police he only had knowledge of a couple of pregnancies, but was told Megan had miscarried. He said the discovery has shocked him as much as anyone. Authorities said they didn't believe he was aware of the murders and was not deemed a person of interest at the time. In the end, there just turned out to be no evidence that would implicate him, officers said. When asked how he could not have known about any of this, the police captain Michael Roberts said, "That's the $1 million question." Furthermore, no one had any idea of how Megan's grown children, who were still living in the house, did not notice their mother was pregnant either. On one occasion, Megan had actually given birth upstairs in the bathroom before killing the newborn and cleaning up, all while members of her family were sat just downstairs. As hearings for Megan Huntsman began, she arrived at court with cuffs around her ankles and wrists, often looking straight at the floor as the legal team spoke. She was held on a $6 million bail, $1 million for each baby. Megan's legal team were keen for a speedy process. It was stated that Megan would not face the death penalty for the charges. This was because she was accused of killing her babies between 1996 and 2006, and this was before the law in Utah changed in 2007. This change in the law made murder a capital offense if a victim was younger than 14. Until this law passed, killing a child was not actually considered one of the factors that could make someone eligible for the death penalty. These were very cold, calculated killings, said prosecutor Jeff Bowman. She was a woman who was remarkably, unbelievably, incredibly indifferent and callous. Judge Daryl McDade was presiding, and he recalled that he was the judge who had signed the initial search warrant on the day that the babies' bodies were found. He said he had quietly hoped and prayed he wouldn't be the one assigned to deal with it in court. "I really thought I'd seen it all until this case. It shocked me then, and it shocked me now," he said. Megan agreed to enter a plea rather than go to trial. This was under an agreement that could reduce her minimum sentence to 5 years. But by taking this, it would leave fewer options for her to appeal down the line. Prosecutors were satisfied to allow this to go ahead and said that it would have been hard to prove a case against her at trial if she hadn't cooperated with police. On February 12, 2015, Megan Huntsman pleaded guilty to all 6 counts of murder. As part of the plea deal, prosecutors had agreed to recommend that the 5 years to life in prison sentences run concurrent to one another. But Judge Daryl McDade was not satisfied by this and said that it would be inappropriate for the terms to run concurrently. Following this, the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole set Megan's parole hearing for April 2064. She will be 89 years old. Prosecutor Jeff Bowman said that even then, he doesn't think she will ever be released. "My guess is that she'll serve the rest of her life," he said. In court, her 3 daughters read statements and stood by their mother, saying she had always been the best mom to them. "No matter what anyone thinks you are a good person," one said. Another read, "This is not the mom I know. The mom I know was the one who had dinner for us every night, a clean house, and was a loving mother. Nobody could guess my mom would do anything like this." Megan's sister and mother also showed their defense of Megan. "Megan is not a monster," her sister told the judge. "She's not evil. From what I understand, she was scared." The crimes of Megan Huntsman left the neighborhood shattered and family and friends utterly devastated. It is simply an unfathomable series of events that cannot be made sense of, and it is something that will haunt many people for a long time to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.